Hello viewers, welcome to weekly State of Affairs program here on QTV, the Gambia's first private TV station, and we are broadcasting from our studios here on Kairaba Avenue. My name is Aliou Cisse, and as usual, I'm joined on the program by my co-host, Sidi Cisse. Sidi,
thanks welcome. So much for having me, Aliou.
Thank you very much, Sidi Cisse, my co-host. We are still looking at the aftermath of the recent heavy downpour, and no doubt, we know the role of Red Cross Society. I mean, they are always the first response when there's disaster. And joining us this week is Mr. Alassane Senghor, who is the Secretary General of the Gambia Red Cross Society. He had also briefly served as the National Coordinator of the Government of the Gambia for COVID-19 Preparedness and Response Program. Mr. Senghor, thank you so much for coming on the State of Affairs program.
Thank you for having me, Aliou.
Great. Let's start this discussion by looking at the Gambia's disaster risk profile. When you look at it, what can you tell us about it?
Well, I think we all know there are a few disasters that are very common. And I think it's cyclic. Every year we face the same, which are particularly during the rainy season. You have flooding, windstorms, and so on, which is different because on the other extreme you have food insecurity, which is if you have low harvest. But I think these past years we've seen more of flooding and windstorms. So this is basically something that, in my view, we should somehow master or be able to manage in a way, both in terms of mitigation, because if you know something is going to happen, you have to put in measures, both in terms of mitigating the risk, but at the same time preparing to respond when and as needed. So definitely, I think when we talk about some of the disasters we're talking about, particularly climate-induced disasters like flooding and windstorms.
And after all this, what has been the role of Gambia Red Cross Society in mitigating, like you said, the impact of the disaster, the floods here,
Thank you. If I go back a bit, the Red Cross was created by an act of parliament to complement government efforts. Particularly, just to summarize, in the humanitarian field, be it in disasters, natural or man-made disasters, may God forbid. But at the same time, we are also doing a lot of development work, and I'll come back to that later. So Red Cross, our core business, one of our core business is preparing and responding to disasters. And of course, when I say preparedness, I'm talking about, in the first instance, it's about the whole cycle of disaster management. And the cycle is about talking about having the right policies in place. Mm-hmm. If you have the right policies in place, then you move from there to putting the plans and the strategies and the preparedness, the level of preparedness of a particular country. So the Red Cross has been, right from the inception, been engaged in supporting government in doing exactly that. And here I can cite, for example, what we call disaster law. Through the International Federation, we have been helping states to first and foremost look at the policy framework, to create the necessary policies and to have the policy environment to be able to predict, prepare, and respond. But above all, the most important thing is prevention. And that I'll come back to that. It's all linked to this whole issue of climate change. So in essence, the Red Cross supports government both in terms of policy, in terms of prevention, in terms of preparedness, and in terms of response. So we have been doing that, and of course we do it in a different way from the government, because I think one of the lessons is that we've learned over the years, since this is our core business, to be able to be smarter in terms of how we deliver response, so that is basically in terms of having the right policies in place, having the right, strategy, and also having what it takes to deliver on those strategies. So I think for us, Red Cross, we have our added value that we bring in on the table, and that is basically ensuring that response is done within the first few hours, if possible, of the disaster.
So in this case, tell us what have your volunteers done, to be specific, in trying to respond to the need of these victims?
Now, I'll go back 2 years back. I think we had floods, we had windstorms, and so on. And what we do in terms of preparedness, first and foremost, we know that every year you'll have one of these. So we have a preparedness plan for the National Society. How do we respond? And the response is about looking at what do we have? How do we respond? What would be the needs? Because the needs in a windstorm disaster is different from the needs from a fire disaster or from flooding. So therefore, what you do is our volunteers are trained in responding to all those kinds of, first and foremost, in terms of gathering information. I can give you an example. This flooding, it happened on a Saturday night. And as it was happening, our volunteers were able to communicate to us to say, look, this is happening and it's going to be bad. So that's when we already, triggered the response mechanism. So we have a response mechanism where we have volunteers trained, we have stock pre-position, the stock that you may need to respond to floods and windstorms and so on. We have all that pre-positioned, both our headquarters and also in the regions, so that they can respond within the shortest possible time. The volunteers are also trained on what to do and how to gather information. Because what we do, we don't just send things or we don't send teams to go and assess. We send teams with material. If it is flooding, we know exactly what the needs would be. Mm-hmm. So they go with the material. And as they deliver the material, they are relieving the victims from the effects of the disaster. So they are mitigating the impact of the disaster, whilst at the same time gathering information in terms of what the needs would be and how the situation would evolve over time. So this is basically what we do. We train volunteers, we equip them, we position stock, and we have a very clear plan as to the next steps in terms of what we do, right from the emergency to the recovery, because there is a cycle. So you have to go a full cycle in terms of responding to disasters.
Okay, Sidi wants to come.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Ali. Yeah. Quickly, Mr. Senghor, and thanks for honoring our invitation. Ali would buttress that we're supposed to have NDMA executive director here too, Mr. Dahaba, but unfortunately he did not show up.
He said he's in a cabinet task force meeting.
Whatever meeting he may have been, this was scheduled anyway. Just to make it clear that we don't just bring Mr. Senghor just have a dig in, on issues, but disaster management agency, the executive director is supposed to be here to help us understand what is happening. Just to make that clear. I would like to know, as far as the Gambia is concerned, our disaster profile, because that's important. In other countries, they have few things that they put in place because they are prone to flood, they are prone to wildfire and stuff. Yes. As far as we are concerned, as a country, what is our disaster profile?
Well, I don't know. In my view, you have to remember, I have been out of the country for some time, but since I got back, as far as I know, I might be wrong, I think they have an act, and even as I said before, through our parent body, the International Federation of Red Cross, a couple of years ago, we engaged the NDMA and the government in a process where we wanted them to update some of these policies that they have, because it's very dynamic. when you may have an act and you may have all these policies in place, but as time goes on, you need to adapt. And there I can give you an example. For example, in disasters today, in most cases, you only give dry ration of food in very rare cases, as opposed to in the past. Now you give cash because one is more dignified, two is more cost effective and efficient, and of course it costs less in the sense that if you were to buy a bag of rice and a 20-liter gallon of oil, you need to buy it in terms of transporting and then the logistics, and also the risk of losing a liter or a kilo of rice is greater. And of course, it's more dignified. So I'm just demonstrating how, just to give an indication of the changes, that a policy for disaster has to be dynamic. It evolves over time. Yes. So we have been working with them for that. In terms of what you said, the profile, yes. I don't think there is, maybe, but I don't think there is, because if it were there, it would reflect on the ground.
Yes.
I have just explained to you how we have our own system, and that reflects on the ground. So whether NDMA has it, I didn't see it on the ground. It may be there.
I think, like you said earlier, and Ali have actually talked about that. Right now where we are, many people with common sense, you think of, how to prevent a disaster.
Yes, sure.
So in doing that, as a country, we must have a profile.
Yes.
We have seen other parts of the world who are prone to bushfire, like wildfires, and they prepare for that.
Exactly.
So if we actually don't know what is our problem, or what may be our disaster, then we're just going to do the firefighting.
No, I think the problem is, you see, it's one thing to know your profile, but it's another thing to recognize it and do something about it. Like I said at the beginning, we all know every year, rainy season, there is flooding and whatever. So this is basically our profile. But whether they have done something about it in terms of, for example, today the people are housed at the St. Augustine's High School.
Yeah.
Under normal circumstances, in a cyclone or earthquake or whatever, you have shelters that are prepared permanently in a certain place, that when there is this, people know where to go. You have all the facilities there. And I think what you are saying is true. If we knew, maybe we know they know the profile, but have they done something about it in terms of preparing for it and going the extra mile in terms of having all those? First, you start with prevention. Okay, because what we are doing today in terms of saying the waterways are blocked and these things, if we knew our profile and we did something about it, we could have triggered that in the planning process. That anybody who is planning an estate or anything, all the parties that are concerned, including NDMA, and I think that should be in the Act, should be consulted. For instance, disaster prevention. Petrol station, if you're building a petrol station, all those things have to be looked at, So basically, in my view, the profile is known by everyone. Whether it's written by NDMA, I'm not sure. But my question is, have they done something about it? If they had done something, and I don't see that on the ground, if they had done something about it on the ground, we would have seen action the first few hours, at not 1 week or 10 days after.
Quickly, finally, before Ali comes here. When you talk about, we talk about the profile, they know something about it. But Mr. Senghor, we all know that studies were done year in, year out. For example, even after the Banjul project, the physical planning department, we were aware they have done a very good study in terms of what are the risks when it comes to flooding. Let's take, for example, Jabang. So many stakeholders were involved. NDMA, National Road Authority, physical plan, all these works were done, thinking that they are going to do something to avert another disaster of flooding. But it's not done, and we come back again. What is responsible for that?
Well, My humble opinion on that is the fact that we don't think ahead of the curve. I think there are many studies that are out there that tells you the profile of certain places, certain countries and islands and all these sort of things. They tell you, I mean, several years ago, I read in a study somewhere that there were small islands that would disappear over time. Okay, so if those studies exist, when you plan, you don't just plan or you give permission for something, you don't just plan for today at that particular time, but you think climate change. To this year, when we received the predictions from the meteorology, it indicates the rain was going to be above average. So basically, we know generally, globally, that there's global warming. The sea level has risen, so there will be patterns of heavy flooding and all these other things. So when we are planning for anything, we don't look at today, we look ahead in terms of some of those environmental, factors or predictions. So in my view, that's what I think. We think today, but we don't look ahead and we don't factor in some of those, critical thinking that is going. Sometimes we rubbish them. You might read an article that tells you in the next 10 years, we're going to have flooding every 1 year or something like that. And you say, this is this. But when you factor those things, they may be true, they may not be, but, sometimes you don't take chances. So in disaster preparedness, you don't take chances. You take everything seriously and you think ahead of the curve.
And like you said, in disaster preparedness, you don't take chances, you take everything serious. I mean, you talk about the lack of shelter, for example, what we have seen in Banjul now. Some of these victims are sheltered at St. Augustine. Whose responsibility is it to take the lead to ensure all these things are put in place?
Let me put it this way. I said at the beginning, the Red Cross is an auxiliary to the government. We were created by an act of parliament to complement government efforts. In any country, the primary responsibility of preparing and responding is the government. That's their responsibility. So, in essence, it goes back to what your question. If we knew our profile and we have, and in fact, the country, I think they have a national disaster preparedness plan. Whether it is updated or not, that's another issue.
Or whether it's just a paper.
Yeah, whether it's just a paper. Because if you have a national disaster preparedness plan,
yes,
that plan takes into consideration all the things, all the potential disasters, and then it look at all the actors, all the government ministries, institutions, organizations, their role, what they can contribute. And it assigns roles and responsibilities to say, if there is flooding, we know fire service has this capacity and they have these resources. They will be the ones to provide that. Red Cross, you have these resources, you have this capacity, you'll be able to do this. Minister of Agriculture, you're supposed to do this. Minister of Work, the Army, all of them, because there is, you talk about the Army, there is civil-military relations.
Absolutely.
You have the Army doing a lot in terms of disaster response. So when you have that plan, it already assigns roles and responsibilities. And then it goes beyond that because it also identifies the resources that are available. So if it happens, like today, if that happened, even in the case of shelter, you don't need to build shelters, but you would have identified locations to say, okay, Friendship Hostel is there, it's owned by government and whatever. When a disaster happens, you should be ready. So you don't need to wait until the disaster happens, then you go looking for places. You would have they would have been part of your disaster preparedness plan. So they know if there's flooding, yes, we need to now evacuate, create space, because how many people, they will come and they will be hosted here. So it's all about that. So basically, in essence, what I'm saying is, if there was a well articulated and a good plan that is updated, and Yeah, one thing is to have it, but it's another thing is to
Mr.
really...
Senghor, one will wonder, if you say all these things, then one will say, what's your relationship with the government?
Very good relations. I would say, you know, CD.
Yes.
You know, we are an auxiliary government, but the bottom line is we have our principles.
Yes.
And a government recognizing and establishing a national Red Cross society accepted all over the world that you accept the Red Cross based on the 7 fundamental principles. And some of those principles are very important. The independence, neutrality of the national society must be safeguarded, meaning that for us, the bottom line is humanity. Wherever there is a need, we don't segregate to say it's for this. So we say
relations about engagement then?
Well,
because
we engage.
There seems to be a vacuum here.
No, there's no vacuum. I think what has happened is that there's a lack of dialogue in terms of...
Are you changing in terms of wording or what? I mean, lack and vacuum, basically the same.
No, I mean, okay, I think there's a vacuum.
Okay,
I think I will agree on that. There's a vacuum because, and the vacuum is, for me, with my experience and with the role that I have, I focus professionally on delivering. And the delays and all these things and the bureaucracy, really for us, it's something. And that's where government maybe takes time. They have a lot of bureaucracy. But for us, you know, we want to deliver. And this is where our principle come in. We will not be bogged down, and that's why we have a principle. We will not be bogged down by bureaucracy, who to give. For us, we do an assessment, we know who are the most vulnerable, we go for them. We don't wait for anything. So this is but I think for me the problem is government needs to engage, be more open. Those who are responsible need to be more open to listening to people, to help them and to guide the process.
I think my
because this is CD. At the end of the day, this is our country, and these are our people, and it affects us, all of us. So therefore, at the end of the day, it's not about me or you. It's about our country, our people. So if you have knowledge and experience, I should be open enough to come and sit with you and say, CD, look, how can we get this done? Because no one knows everything. So basically, I think this is what is lacking. Government, whosoever is responsible, needs to engage, not only Red Cross, but I know there are Gambians out there. I was in the diaspora working outside for so many years. Wherever I went, I have seen so many professional Gambians in different fields. If we were open to bring them, use their experience and their capacities, definitely this country would have been elsewhere. And I must say this as an anecdote. Anywhere that I have been internationally, sometimes, in most cases, there is another Gambian. And sometimes people come to me and say, we don't understand. That small country, in any big institution you go to, there is one Gambian in a senior position. Why can't we use that? We leverage on that, on the capacity and the experience and the network of Gambians. If we were able to do that, this country would have moved. So basically, that's where where the problem is.
I just want to come in here because you're talking about the need for collaboration, proper coordination. I mean, we have the National Disaster Management Agency. How do you work with the NDMA?
Well,
especially during these trying times when we have these floods.
Look,
have you have any round table discussion?
Sure. I think you know, I said in one of your programs, I think it's a lack of understanding what the role coordination means. We work very closely with NDMA. Actually, they're supposed to be coordinating all disasters in this country. As I said before, it's government primary responsibility and duty to manage disasters. I think they've had meetings and they've organized, even planning meetings before this. Okay? But the reality is what I said earlier on. I think some of us could have contributed if they were open in terms of the way they should deliver on their coordination role. So, and I think, you know, that would have made things easier.
Are you saying they are not open up as they should?
Well,
in your own view?
we are not engaged enough. We are only engaged to say, what do you do? But not at the level of holistic and critically looking at disaster management in this country. You know, I think that's where, I mean, there has been meetings and this thing, but I think we need to do more in terms of doing that.
So nothing holistic as far as, you know, coordination is concerned.
You know, CD, it's about what you consider coordination. If I ask each of you, you would have a different interpretation of coordination. But for me, in terms of disaster management and the role, what I think the role of the NDMA should be, is basically from the outset. It happened on Saturday, Sunday. Even that Sunday night, Sunday afternoon, NDMA would have commandeered a meeting with all the stakeholders at highest level, ministries, everybody, sit around the table. We are having flooding, health, go right into action. Agriculture, go right into action. These works, go right into action. Red Cross, go right into action. You know, I don't want to compare anything, but you know, you just they had the same. They had floodings in Senegal. Yeah. Mm-hmm. What did they do? They put all ministries. Everybody sat. They say, you do this, you do this, you do this. Okay, they've done that here, but at a very technical level. You know. So for me, I think, you know, we should learn from this. I'm saying this in good faith because I really want things to be better.
Well, others will say, you know, our vulnerability, that is our lack of capacity in implementing disaster risk. Some will say that we may have lack of capacity as a country.
Well, you know, capacity is very relative, but it goes back to what I said earlier on.
If I can just give an example, you know, in Jaban, for example, you might be fed up with the word Jaban, you know.
By the way, he's the spokesperson of Jaban Estate, so he's very much concerned about Jaban.
For Jaban.
we had an excavator that came, got stuck, and they had to bring another excavator to take the excavator out, and that too got stuck. And guess what? I told them in Mandinka the other day when they were there with all of them, I said, Julubula Julo, Julubondi Julo, no Jolana The rope you need to get the bag out of the well, if that drop, that's it. Yeah. So you see, we had these two excavators stuck in there, and we had nothing to get them out. You know, they wanted to use a crane, but it was not good enough. So when it comes to the capacity, I know in other parts of the world, definitely you'll have an equipment to get these excavators out. So it had to be dig out to come out.
You see, that's why I said capacity is relative, because it goes back to disaster planning. Yeah. You know, and I can say you know it very well, that NDMA, they have, is it excavator or
what? Is there excavator that got stuck?
They have.
They have. Is there one that got stuck?
Okay, they have excavators. Why were they given the excavators and trucks and everything? It was part of the Japanese government, from what I understand, Japanese government contribution to disaster preparedness of the NDMA. Okay? But that really is so many years back. You know, so basically technology has evolved. You know, do you need excavators today, or do you have to have excavators or not? So you're absolutely right. It's a question of capacity, but for me, it's about organization, and it goes back to a well-articulated disaster preparedness plan.
Thank you very much, viewers. So you're still watching State of Affairs here on QTV, the Gambia's first private TV station, and we're broadcasting from our studios here on Kairaba Avenue. My name is Aleu Sise, and our guest this week is Mr. Alassane Senghor, who is the Secretary General of the Gambia Red Cross Society. We'll go with a short break, and when we return, discussion continues.
Espas Motors is the largest and most modern auto service in the Gambia. Espas Motors is the only authorized dealer in Chevy, Mercedes-Benz trucks, Mercedes-Benz buses, Kia, Ford, futon mini and midi buses, futon trucks. At Espace Motors, we have qualified professionals who use modern technology to diagnose and repair all brands of motor vehicles. Espace Motors services include auto sales, auto repairs, vehicle painting, availability of high-quality spare parts, towing services. We are reachable at any time. Call Espace Motors on 352222 353-4444 or locate us on the Bertil Harding Highway. Espace Motors.
Welcome back from the short break. You're watching State of Affairs here on QTV. I am Aliou Cisse here with my co-host Sidi Cisse, and our guest this week is Mr. Alassane Senghor, Secretary General of the Gambia Red Cross Society. I mean, at the start of the program, you talk about how you deploy your volunteers to help gather information. I mean, from your own understanding, what is the level of damage caused by the recent floods?
Well, it depends really where you're talking from, because we have two.
Like if you had to make your own comparison compared to the past floods and the one.
Well, this is serious. This is really serious, and this is where, when you look at Banjul, for example, the damage could be even bigger, both in terms of the loss for the families. Because can you imagine the number of houses that have been flooded? Is huge. When you look at, if I remember the figures right, because we have it in our operations center, I think we've done an analysis, and I think when it comes to houses that have collapsed partially or completely, West Coast is on the high side. I think it's around 30% or something like that. Then Banjul also, it's also very high, and most of the houses in Banjul is flooded. So West Coast and KM and North Bank and a bit in URR, you have houses that have collapsed partially or completely. But in Banjul, you have, in most cases, houses that are flooded with household goods and everything, furniture, food stuff that have been washed away. So basically, it's really very, very high compared to the previous ones. So definitely, this is I wouldn't say major, but in the Gambian context, it's a major disaster.
So what do you do with this information, knowing all this thing now?
We are. We use the information we gathered in the first instance was to see how we can assist the people. Okay. For instance, we tried to respond the first hours of the disaster. So this time, in 2 years back, we used to respond 8 hours or even more. Last windstorm, we responded, I think, about 5 hours. This time, I think it was about 3 hours. We were on the ground with some material. So the information that we gather enables us to know what their needs are and what to prepare in terms of response. So by the third day, we were able to understand that there were almost 600 and something households that were affected in these 3 regions. So what we did was we sent that to our head office in Geneva, okay, because we have this disaster relief emergency fund. Okay. And we said there are 600 and something households that are affected. So we have a fund there that they can release quickly like that. So they were able to release 300,000 Swiss francs, which we are now using we're going to do some cash transfer to the families, affected families, 2 forms of cash. One is for them to help themselves buy food and other stuff for the house. And then we have another set of cash for people that's houses were collapsed partially or completely so that they can rebuild.
So how do you determine who gets support? I mean, when this thing happens in a neighborhood, perhaps, the level of destruction might not be the same. I mean, but because Red Cross is coming into support, everybody expects to get the same support. So how do you deal with this?
We have what we call vulnerability assessment. We assess the vulnerability of our volunteers are trained to do that. Okay. So you walk in there, the vulnerability. You ask questions, the family size, female-headed household, widows and all those other things, or bigger families and so on. So based on the vulnerability, and also you look at the structure. Based on, even CD lives in Jabang, but I wouldn't go to see this house.
You wouldn't come to my house.
I wouldn't go to see this house. But I was in Jabang, was it yesterday or the day before yesterday?
Oh, you didn't see the excavator stock here?
Well, I think I went the other way around. So we got into the water and, and all this.
This is spokesperson.
But in Jabang, I had to go to some of those pull footers who are squatting.
Yeah.
Their house completely
Yes,
collapsed. So
yes.
I passed through all those nice houses.
I must tell you this info. Your guys were there even yesterday, but you say you wouldn't come. They came to my house and gave me some purification water.
Yeah, well, that's for everyone.
They came.
Water purification is for everyone, because you see, that's the most important thing, because our response is comprehensive.
Oh.
When we assess, we look at what are the risks. We know that in flooding, there's risk of water contamination and, waterborne diseases and so on.
And they gave me enough to take me for a long time, because each tablet,
So
I should use it with 5 liters of water. So that is very good.
You see,
I'm really taking care of. Thank you to Red Cross.
No, so you see, this is part of our preparedness plan, because we work with UNICEF. We work with UNICEF, UNFPA, and all those things. So UNICEF and us, we do a planning. So they give us stock of all those things we keep in our warehouse. So it's very handy. We could just take them and deliver them.
Thank you.
So can we say, I mean, despite what you said, that lack of engagement, you always have your internal preparedness.
Yes, sure.
As okay.
Yeah, sure.
They were there at my door to help me. And quickly, I'm glad that you talked about West Coast and being at least the highest in terms of houses that have collapsed. But again, if you looked at West Coast, say for example, the houses that have collapsed in Jambanjeli, I mean, this is not the first time.
Yes.
It's not the second time.
Yes.
It's not the third time. Mm-hmm. And those people, those stakeholders actually knew what the problem was.
Yes.
Because when the road was built, they didn't do a proper drainage for those poor people sitting in Jambanjeli. I'm calling them poor, not because they're poor as such, but it's really hard on them. And every year, in and out, their houses will collapse. So when you talk about prevention, how effective is the prevention in this country? Because somebody sits there and call himself an executive director of disaster management, whatever you may call it, and sit to wait for Alasan's house to collapse, year in, year out. Somebody must be held responsible.
No, I think, CD, this is a collective responsibility. And it goes back to what I said in terms of a very good and comprehensive disaster preparedness plan. Because preparedness is not about only preparing to respond, it's about prevention. For example, planning, I said it earlier on, it should be part of the whole thing. But disaster management, which it's a continuum process. Continuum meaning that you respond and people recover, but you go beyond that, factor that into your development planning. Okay, so this is not done. Okay, you heard the vice president went and said, we have to relocate these people, which is good. And it reminds me, a few years back it happened in Kotu. I remember I was out there, we supported the Red Cross here, and there was a relocation package, people from Kotu to be relocated somewhere. I understand. They were given land.
Yes.
I don't know whether they sold the land or
some of them sold the land.
Okay.
Some of them sold the land.
When you do those things, you need to plan it, organize it well. Okay. So disaster management continuum is about looking ahead in terms of preventing the recurrence of those disasters. So this is where it should come. I give you an example. During there was flooding 2 years ago in Basse, around Basse, just behind Mankamanko. I don't remember Sari Jalo, or there's a village there. There was a woman whose house was struck by lightning, and the house collapsed, and the child died there.
I remember you built it.
We built a house after that. What did we do? We built a house that is a model house that would be flood resistant. Okay? So this is part of our disaster management continuum process. When you see in the global humanitarian network, you have the blue pillar and the red pillar. The red pillar is the Red Cross movement. We work with the UN and everyone. And in most cases, you remember the UN reforms, not this last one, the ones before, they talked about, shelter, who is responsible. The Red Cross, or the IFRC was assigned a convener for shelter. So Red Cross over the years developed skills and competencies around shelter, meaning that when there is a disaster, we don't just go deliver and then we do help people to recover, but also factor in that if flooding happens again, they would survive, their houses would survive. So this is what is lacking in this context. So that's why I'm saying it's a full cycle. So it shouldn't just end at delivering rice and oil and people go back. And I hope it's not going to be the same, that people go back to their houses and then they demolish.
They have to build their mud houses again.
No, I mean, so this is where now it comes, that's where the multi-sectoral approach is very important, because if disaster preparedness plan was there, which is going to go full cycle, all these ministries of planning, construction, whatever are involved in the whole thing, they would go and advise they wouldn't build for them, but they would advise the people who are rebuilding their houses how to build it to be more resistant from flood.
But if you are participating in the building, you see a community that every year their house will collapse because you don't do the job properly.
Yes.
And you come there just cups of rice, cups of sugar, cups of oil, and then you go back and sit in your office.
Yes.
And the next year too, they will suffer.
Exactly.
You do the same thing.
Yes.
I mean, that for me is unforgivable.
You know our role, and that's why I'm so happy that we are talking about this, because for us, our role is not only to deliver and whatever. And that's why our independence is good, because we advocate on behalf of the vulnerable people. What we are saying now, we are free to say it. We are not saying it for us, but we are saying it for the people who are suffering, so that people out there who can make decisions can understand, So for me, what is important is that when you have a disaster, you go full cycle. Today, those people that we are going to support to rebuild, we make sure, like even in Basse, after the windstorm in the URR, we brought some local carpenters to Basse, from their villages to Basse. We brought a shelter expert from the IFRC who spent time here, training them on how to make their rafters more resistant to windstorm. So this is what should happen now for those houses. So there are ways, and we have some experts here, Gambians who are experts in urban planning and whatever. They should be able to help. And that's what goes back to what I said earlier on. If government was able to mobilize all the skills and experience and expertise within Gambians, either in the diaspora or here, they would be able to contribute to alleviating or mitigating the risk of disasters.
I mean, like you said, you've spent many years, dealing with issues related to disaster and, risk reduction and all those things. When you look at the case of, for example, Banjul, Tobacco Road, looking at the location where people are settling, Ibo Town, for instance, what would be your suggestion? What do you think is a long-term solution to address future what's been happening?
Sometimes, in my experience, not only in Gambia, in many places, I remember I was head of region for Western Central Africa based in Dakar, 2004, 2005. They had heavy flooding, and some of those houses remain in water for months. The issue is always politics. Let's be realistic. Okay. It's about politics. Government can decide.
What do you mean by politics?
I'll come to that. Government can decide those people living in Ibo Town and Tobacco Road and all those places or whatever to say they need to move. Okay, but enforcing that is another thing. What happened in Kotu?
Yes,
they were given land. So you really have to be bold. Can a government that is elected be bold enough to deal with those issues? We've seen it in other countries. I wouldn't say names. In other countries where there was a plan to move people, you know where I'm talking about. A plan to move people. A whole city was built.
Yes.
But when you go to where these people who are allocated land, where they are from, it's still there and still flooded. So it's the issue of whether the leadership or the government is really bold enough and willing to risk, that thing. But in my view, as an experience in this field, this is the only solution. And it's the only solution. Otherwise, we come back, as you said, every year, doing relief. And sooner or later, people get tired, especially those people who are giving us the resources for it. So at some point, there must be bold decisions taken by government to save lives.
So what are the challenges in terms of disaster risk management? Is this one of the things that you've just mentioned? You allocate people land, probably give them some money to go and build homes, and they decided not to go, but sold the land, and then sit in their old homes, and then the following year we have a disaster.
For me, dialogue is very important. I think in some cases where we have worked with communities, it's about dialogue. You don't just go to Manjai or Kotu and say, no, you are moving. No, you have to engage them in a dialogue. Talking to them, engage them, let them own the process, let them understand the risk, and let them own the process. If they own the process, they understand the risk, and you bring out the added value or the benefits from it. That's one thing. The second thing, which I think was also the mistake, because it's not all the fault of the people. If I move you from Jaban, and I want to take you to Queenala, not even in the middle of nowhere.
Yes.
Your kids have to go to school.
Yes.
You have to go to the market. You have to have access to health. You have to have access to other things. I mean, without dialogue and all this, or without even putting some of those facilities in place, it will not happen.
So can one say continuity too was the problem? Because I think these things happen, or this allocation or resettlement was part of the APRC regime. It was during a year or so before his regime was out. This scheme came in, and he was the one who allocated this land. So all of a sudden, by 2016 December, he was out. So this would feel like, what?
Which one? You're talking about your estate?
No, we're talking about Kotu, for example.
No, but this Kotu was a long time ago. If I remember, was it 2007, 8, around there. It was long time ago. No, that was long time ago. That was long time ago. I remember because
all the force that Jammeh had, sit there and it.
No, because that time, I think I was regional director, and we had to send our head of sub-region in Dakar to come and support them in that process. But I think the challenge was basically there was dialogue with the community, not enough dialogue, because that was what we did. I know Mr. Mohamed Faye, our colleague, was the one we assigned to come and support them. And they did vulnerability assessment. They talked to the communities. But what was the problem was, the people were saying, my kids are going to school here. I'm selling in the market here. I get my bread and butter. So if you take me there, how would I come every day to buy or to do my stuff and the kids to school? So relocation is all about well thought through plan with the people concerned. You don't just relocate. You think through it, you discuss with the people, you engage them, you help them to own the process. And then you look at the facilities, the receiving end, what would be the needs, their basic needs. Even you, if I give you free land to say move right away, you won't. You would think, where would I do this? Where would I do that?
Yes.
So that's the reality.
You want to move me to Dongoroba, I will start thinking.
Exactly. So basically, for me, I think we need to engage the people in dialogue and help them to understand and for them to own the process. And that would make it smooth.
Yeah, I just want to come in here, Mr. Senghor. I mean, you talk about how you intervene, how you try to respond to the needs of the victims, how you deploy your volunteers. I mean, let's look at what are some of the challenges you faced while trying to respond to some of these disasters. The challenges you face as Red Cross volunteers out there, volunteering to ensure people get what they want. I'm so sometimes you might get the feedback from your volunteers relating to some of the challenges they face here and there.
Well, externally, I think the people are very receptive, and the volunteers are great. I really cannot thank them enough. I mean, anywhere across the country, when a disaster happens, they will be the first to call. Not only call, but they will be on the ground helping. You've seen them in Kotu.
All over the
They are doing it without us knowing. So I think the main challenge is about resources. Sometimes, and in this case, like I said, when we were assessing and we wanted to really get something on the ground, we knew that it was 600 and something families. Now it's over almost 2,000, 1,600 and something families or 2,000 households affected. So the gap in terms of responding, for us, we can at this point support 600 and something families.
Out of 1,000?
Out of 1,000. So there will be almost about 1,000 families that will not be. But in reality, what should have happened, going back to what I said earlier on, if NDMA played their role, they would have put that on the table and bring all the players and say, okay, Red Cross, you can do 600. Take the 600. This other organization can do another 200 or 500 or whatever. Then the whole picture would be covered. Everybody would be served, But so far, well, I've not had anything.
So I mean, when I saw your team around, I was quite curious, and I asked them, how do you go around in terms of how do you identify homes? Knowing fully that Gambia, we don't have street names, we don't have compound numbers and all that. And this young chap, very brilliant, say, you know what, we take a street right to the end. And we take another street right to the end. Yeah. So is that something that really affects your work, where you have no street name, compounds are not numbered? How do you even actually audit, some of, the reliefs that you do, and how your guys go out there to identify which compounds they go to?
No, it delays, but we are lucky in the sense that most of our volunteers are part of those communities. If you go to Kotu here now, they even have a makeshift office there, which has been there, Kotu Home Link. Wow. So they are part of those communities. So they know everybody, they know every corner. But in the context, yes, it's a challenge. It's a big challenge now. In some instances, it's a big challenge. But the way we are organized, we are structured, is that in each of the regions, we have a branch office, and then we have branch officers, we have area youth reps, and so on. So in most regions, we have motorbikes, bicycles, and all these things.
To ease their mobility.
Ease their mobility. And sometimes we refund them their transport fares, and, if possible, we deploy vehicles to go and support their work. But of course, identifying people, it's not easy because of but because the community also trusts the Red Cross. Okay. So they will come and tell you, look, the other day I was visiting Ibo Town. We had done an assessment, we had a number of households, but at 3 points where we stopped, some people will come and say, my house is flooded, have somebody been no? So people are beginning to come out, as they see a sign, or they hear that some people are receiving assistance, they come out, But again, coming back to your question, I think our main challenge is really resources, because we also don't want to, we have minimum standards. When we assist, we determine the amount of money we give, or the oil we give, or the rice, or the clothing, based on what we call sphere minimum standards. This is a global
Thank you, Mr. Senghor.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Mr. Alassane Senghor. Well, viewers, I'm afraid with that we bring an end to this week's program, State of Affairs. Like I said at the beginning, we were meant to have the Executive Director of the National Disaster Management Agency, Sana Dahaba, on the program, but on the last minute, he told us he was in a cabinet task force meeting. What they were discussing, maybe we'll try to have him in our subsequent edition to discuss more about what the NDMA is doing as the agency responsible for disaster matters. Once again, Mr. Senghor, thank you so much for coming on the State of Affairs program. Well, viewers, on behalf of the production team, my co-host, I was your host, Alu Sise. Do join us next week. Until then, bye-bye.